Teddy's newest arrival that day was looking around the large room. He felt that he ought to find something to say, but should he speak first, and to whom? A jumbo said, "Welcome to nursery land. You feel a bit lost, I can tell." "Don't worry," he said as he held out his hand. "On the whole, we're treated quite well." The new dog said, "That's a relief, I confess. Yes, you all look quite spruce, I can see. Except perhaps one." And the jumbo said, "Yes? Well now, tell me, which one would that be?" "Well, the shabbier one of the two teddy bears. He's not fluffy and bright like his brother. He has a small darn on one side of his chest and a pair of white wings on the other." "Well, perhaps," Jumbo said. "He's a bit tatty, though he is old. Just how old we're not sure, but his early life's quite an adventure, you know. He once flew in the Second World War. That darn is the scar of a wound he sustained when his aeroplane came under fire, and those other things, the insignia wings, are the badge of an RAF flyer. His tale's as true yet as strange as can be of a teddy bear's ultimate glory. I'll tell it to you as he told it to me. And this is the teddy bear's story. In the days of an England whose place in the sun was an empire spread in full flower, on an atlas bedecked in a pastel reflection of British imperial power, the years of the musical comedies sigh, passed in manner genteel, well-to-do, but perhaps for the music the tones were too high and the comedy shared by too few. Beside all the stylish scenes, in the wings waits a troop from a different corps, and the overture strains are the tight-coiled springs for the start of the Second World War. The worst became known and the laughter died down. Anxiety started to rise. Young men must be ready to fight on the ground, in the oceans, and up in the skies. Now, sometime before the start of that war, our Teddy was owned by a boy, to whom he'd belonged since the day he was born, and was really his favourite toy. Through long summer days, they'd played, and inevitably they'd got dirty. The boy's dirt washed off, but Teddy had worn most of his since about 1930. Through dark winter evenings in games by the fire, Teddy's place was by Paul, preferential to the rest of the toys. His performance was vague, but his presence seemed always essential. Gradually yielding to beckoning slumbers, they'd eventually settle in bed, among odd bits of Ludo or jigsaw by numbers and prayers that were only half said. As happens with boys, they soon finish with toys, and Ted went from forlorn to forlorner. When the others, as feared, one by one disappeared, at least he stayed on in the corner. But Ted remained true to the boy he'd seen through from his earliest full stops and commas to English, French, his jog and maths in matric, and now off to fly RAF bombers. Quite understandably, in recent years, Paul's attention had been somewhat cursory, but just on the day he was going away, he took one last look round the nursery. Just a look at the things that I'm leaving behind me, before I go goodness knows where. Perhaps I'll take one of you just to remind me. How about you, Teddy Bear? Hey, that's an idea. I really just might. My aircraft's in need of a mascot. I'm a bit old for toys, so you keep out of sight. At any rate, till we're past Ascot. Yes, that's what I'll do. You can fly with my crew, then stay in the sheds. Or at best, you might sit by the wall in the bar, after all. There's a bear on the squadron's crest. So whisked off he was for a sudden adventure, stuffed in a bag, quite unsighted, upside down and with one foot stuck under his chin, and he couldn't have been more excited. When at last they were there, by the airfield's cold glare, he realised that so many years' rest left him childishly clad and embarrassingly bare. All he wore was a little blue vest. The Winko just entered as Paul had unpacked. "What's that short-vested bear doing here?" "Well, sir, we've got no mascot, and he volunteered. Oh, well, it was just an idea." "That short little vest," said the Winko, "won't do. His togs should be similar to my kit. Arrange for a cap and a proper best blue." Well, you've never seen anything like it. They kitted him out with a full uniform, at what cost and from where the mind boggles, a smart pair of wings, pilot officer's rings, and even a helmet and goggles. If I were to tell you all that happened thereafter, you'd probably think I was lying, but as new squadron mascot, his life was all laughter and singing and shouting and flying. They went on to ops, and they did pretty well, and they came back intact, more or less. And as soon as they landed like bats out of hell, they all made a dash for the mess. And there Teddy had his own place at the bar, on which he sat proudly displayed. And this dressing-up business got quite out of hand. They'd even had flying boots made. Sometimes he was toasted and tossed in the air to loud cries of "Attaboy, Ted!" And the smart cap he wore would get thrown on the floor, and occasionally beer on his head. But things hotted up, and the pace was intense. They soon knew what having things hard meant. The barrage built up, and the fighters grew sharp, and they had to withstand the bombardment. The tougher the course, the more daring the deeds, the more casual in the recounting. In the nightly apocalypse, horsemen and steeds knew their losses were steadily mounting. One early dawn, when the fighting was done, but the casualty rate had been double, Paul and Ted circled for their turn to land, and the aircraft in front was in trouble. His bomb doors were stuck, so he came in still loaded, certainly bringing too much down. He drifted a bit as they watched, then exploded, just after making a touchdown. Well, that's how it was. They had to accept it, having their pals drown or burn. Of course, nobody said, but occasionally Ted felt that sometime it might be their turn. Or one night they were on a particular raid, and the crew, in the way of the youthful, were messing about, not the least bit afraid, and Paul's thoughts were elsewhere, to be truthful. While remembering a joke he must tell certain folk when next they meet back at the station, he found he was watching the wing lined with holes by a Messerschmitt's neat perforation. The next thing, an engine had burst into flames, and the probable loss of a wing made Paul straightway decide that the crew must bail out, the only last possible thing. Paul shouted jump as the Lancaster weaved to the tune of the Messerschmitt shell. In the glare of the searchlights, the voice of the guns bade the last of the airmen farewell. Paul picked Ted up after waiting a spell and said, "Come on, Ted. That's the lot." He'd be jumping with Paul, which was maybe as well, for a parachute, something he'd not. Now, what had they forgotten a parachute for? Though the neat little tunic they'd found might look sweet as he jumped through the parachute door, it's a bloody long way to the ground. So they'd give up the plane to the wind and the rain, but the Messerschmitt hounded them still, and the struts in the fuselage splintered again as the fighter returned for the kill. Then, a rat-a-tat-tat, a sharp stab in the back, and everything suddenly colder. Ted was dazed for a bit, but he knew he'd been hit as the sawdust spilled down from his shoulder. Then, another explosion. This time, great commotion as thunder and sparks filled the cockpit, and when the smoke cleared, it was just as he feared. His lifelong companion had copped it. A windscreen was shattered, and drops of blood spattered in streaks along perspex and cable. The aircraft was battered, and nothing now mattered to Paul, who'd done all he was able. He'd opened his eyes, less in pain than surprise that he'd missed instant death by a fraction, but his being chilled through, he went numb as he knew he couldn't move or take any action. Then, "Your wings, Ted," said Paul. "You can now earn at last. Just turn round and fly back to Dover. I'm sorry, old son, but I'm fading out fast, so perhaps you'd better take over." Now, there is an odd thing which can happen with toys, and to adults not commonly known, when the love of the person to whom they belong can give them a life of their own. Paul's throwaway hopes in the last desperate gasp when a man's disbelief had gone still had raised certain misty perceptions of force so that Teddy could work out his will. To a Teddy whose days pass in sitting quite still in a cupboard or up on a shelf, it's suddenly odd to be able to feel and have power to move by yourself. He seemed to know all the things Paul must have known and inherited skills he detected. Then he made himself jump, for his voice was like Paul's. But then, what else would you have expected? It's hard to accommodate movement and thought and sensation so strangely attractive in one tiny life. If it's got to be short, then by God, it's going to be active. He grabbed at the throttle, still gave a fair lick, got a sight of the moon through the dome, then kicked on the rudder and yanked on the stick, banked steeply and turned back for home. Which was all very clever, but just a bit rash in view of such recent transition. With the plane still a wreck, they might well have crashed, but he managed to right their position. The way they were struggling just to keep height didn't look good for getting them back. Then a flash and a shell bursting just to their right. Oh, hell! Now they'd run into flak. Now, if all the vocabulary you'd been taught had remained until now ineffective, you're bound to have remnants of childish retort, amongst other strong adult invective. Like, "You've had all our crew and we've made our donation in blood and skin, sawdust and fur, so sod off, you bastards, you're not having us, you can go rot in hell, so there." Yeah. Then he thought of their bombs. They still had a full load. The bomb doors still worked, and what's more, at the press of a button, they'd all sail away to rain down on who knows. Well, that's war. The aeroplane lifted. Well, that felt a bit lighter. At least they were in with a chance, unless by the moon some insomniac fighter should single them out for a dance. After what felt like ages, they seemed to be leaving the land and were over the sea. "Looks like England ahead, and seeing's believing. Might even have muffins for tea." Right, let's have a check. Pressure gauge a bit flat, not bad for fuel. Compass still there, no altimeter. Who cares about that so long as we're up in the air? Might be a bit bumpy, I'll have to hang on. Then I must fix Paul in with a strap. Now the rudder seems jammed, but the ailerons work. Uh-oh, that's a shame. There's no flap. The wing dipped again and a starboard prop fluttered as they brushed under land's cloudy curtain. You know how you'd describe the odd language he muttered. Not nursery rhymes, that's for certain. Now, strict RT silence was always the rule to avoid any Hun interception, but a teddy bear flying a Lancaster home might already be deemed an exception. So he had to call base. In about half an hour, he ought to be back at this speed. Wendleby Tower, Wendleby Tower. This is Nighthawk 1-4. Do you read? Silence. The radio crackle and... Nighthawk 1-4, this is Wendleby Tower. What state are you in? Well, we might make it back if we don't lose direction or power. Roger, Nighthawk 1-4. Cloud 2/10 at 1 thou, but within half an hour could be double. If you want GCA, can commence letdown now. I take it you might be in trouble. Well, we've gained a few holes in the course of a rumpus, so everything gets quite an airing. In the hope that I'm not a demagnetized compass, perhaps you could give us a bearing. Steer 305, said the voice. Then more heated. You quite okay up there, Paul? Steering 305, Teddy calmly repeated, not answering the last part at all. The tower seemed puzzled. Hey, Paul, is that you? Then, faced with a joke or a lie, he said, who do you think it is, Winnie the Pooh, and smiled at this clever reply. Roger, Nighthawk 1-4, winds at 13 knots, Queen Nanhao 1014. When you join circuit, use runway 22. We can't use 330 anymore. Wendleby Tower, I can sight you at last, and don't wish to indulge in dramatics, but 2/3 of a Lancaster fading out fast isn't ideal for dawn aerobatics. No flap and jammed rudder can make tricky driving, with only my poor hand that I've hurt. So if we're too high when arriving, I can't even zigzag to land. Roger 1-4. Message quite understood. We'll have all other aircraft diverted. There are some runway flares. Watch the caravans green. The station is fully alerted. Still no joy with the flaps, and I've only one green, but I'm going to give it a try. Roger 1-4. You are now clear to land. Emergency crew standing by. I don't trust a touchdown to go round again. In this state, I can't risk a pass. I'll have to assume that the undercart's gone and make a crash land on the grass. Roger, Nighthawk 1-4. We've sighted you now. Your run-in looks okay to us. Good luck. One last thing, and the airfield's all yours. How many crew left in your bus? Nighthawk 1-4, I'm heading down now, so stand by for action and fun. Oh, yes. The rest of the crew bailed out, so just order breakfast for one. One Duff engine croaked at the critical point as the edge of the runway loomed large. Teddy just jerked the starboard wing up off the ground, but went in with the grace of a barge. The grass rushed beneath them, all spinning and blurred, while Teddy, awaiting the chop, watched the wings flail and fracture like some dying bird. But they slowed down and ground to a stop. Still unconscious, Paul shifted and mumbled some unclear complaint about feeling a draught. No teddy bear's picnic had they had, but, well, the Almighty himself might have laughed. Then as soon as the rescuers came on the scene, Ted's shoulder at once ceased to hurt. He immediately became just the Teddy he'd been, stiff of limb, glassy-eyed, and inert. 2 engines gone and shot full of holes, rudder half jam and no flap. How on earth did he make it? Then, very surprised, here is a teddy bear perched on his lap. Teddy wanted to shout when the doc said, not dead. And I think that with luck he'll survive. Only this time the shout had to stay in his head. He's alive! He's alive! He's alive! He's still losing blood, said the doc, so we'd best get him out and across to the tower. What puzzles me is his condition suggests he's been out cold for over an hour. So that's how the bear you see over there saved the life of the pal he loved dearly. But that isn't all. I'm afraid to say, Paul, well, you see, it was rather sad, really. The story of Teddy, hands on the controls, on Paul's lap when returning from action, had a strange ring for most, and he soon was the toast of the mess, quite the current attraction. But Teddy just waited to be there for Paul, to be talking or singing a song to. But the day he returned, he looked oddly at Ted and said, who's that mascot belong to? Some fellas looked down and some dragged their beer. Then one, trying not to sound false, said, he came the same day as you did, you know. And Paul smiled and said, oh yes, of course. Of Teddy, though all else seemed perfectly clear and the debt he could never repay, or their friendship before, not the vaguest idea. And I don't suppose he knows to this day.